You are listening to the IFH Podcast Network. For more amazing filmmaking and screenwriting podcasts, just go to ifhpodcastnetwork.com.
You got to be confident in what you're doing, because if you're not, then there's no reason, no one else will ever be confident in you. You have to be confident in yourself, number one, and then other people can basically trust you. And in our business, it's so tough already that if you don't project that confidence, I think it makes it way tougher.
Hey everyone, thanks again for hitting that play button. Before I get to this week's show, I just want to say thank you to my friends at Second Class Cinema. My friends at Second Class Cinema, they're a podcast, and every week they get together, they watch a B movie, and then they get together to discuss it. So my suggestion for them to watch was a movie called The Uninvited from 1988. I don't want to spoil it for you. I will link to it in the show notes. It's just one of those bad movies that's so bad it's good, which I often talk about on this show, especially if you listened to last week's show with Chris Gore. And they actually gave me a shout out on the show. So I will link also to the show that Second Class just had with my suggestion for The Uninvited. If that sounded a little confusing as it sounded, I will link to it in the show notes. Again, davebullis.com. I have all my show notes there, and everything is in a nice, orderly fashion. And I also want to say thank you to everyone that promotes the show, shares the show. Particularly, I want to say thank you to Jason Buff at Indie Film Academy. I want to say thank you to my friends at Podcast Reviews, Todd Matthews, Roger, Coach B Films, Kessler Comics, Jenna Edwards, Patrick J. Russell, Indie Film NYC, and everyone else. Just in case I'm forgetting you, I'm very sorry. Like my friends like Doc Kennedy. I want to say thank you, everyone who keeps sharing the show. It's so important now that you have other people sharing the show, and it's not just me out there sharing it. I also want to say a big congratulations to Alex Ferrari at Indie Film Hustle. Alex just had the 100th episode of his podcast with guest Aaron Kaufman, who is Robert Rodriguez's former producing partner. Coincidentally enough, Aaron is actually going to be coming on this show along with Brian Levin, and they're going to be discussing their new film, Flock of Dudes. So be sure to check that out. Also coming up on the podcast is SS Wilson from Stampede Entertainment. You might know SS from the Tremors movies, and we're going to be talking about the new Tremor TV show starring Kevin Bacon. And also coming up on the podcast is Whitney Davis from Whitney Davis Literary Agency. So, if you have any questions for any of these guests, please tweet them over to me. It's at Dave_Bullis, or you can just send me an email, dave@davebullis.com. And also, on this week's episode of the podcast, my guest's new film, Initiation, which he co-wrote, is being distributed by Gravitas Ventures. We talk writing, working as a development executive, and so much more. This is episode 127 with guest Dan Benamor.
You're listening to the Dave Bullis Podcast.
Hey, Dan, thanks a lot for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
So, Dan, just to get started, since you've listened to the show before, you know what the first question's going to be. And that question, Dan, is, how did you get your start in the film industry?
Well, for me, it's, I guess the real definitive moment was I came out here to LA and I got an internship with a production company. And then I was doing that for about 6 months, and I pretty much, I ended up getting hired as an assistant. And then I got promoted from there, and eventually I became the head of development. So it was sort of, really, I guess if you broke it down, it would probably be when I just first got hired from an intern to actually being an assistant. And then it sort of snowballed from there.
Now, does that still work in a similar way? Because things are always changing, and with the changing face of the distribution and everything, is it still that way where you think interns are used as sort of like that farm system where they can be brought up within an agency?
my opinion on it, was that because I was at a small company where basically, the principles of the company were right there. Like, you're dealing with them every day. And it wasn't, I think that sometimes if you go for an internship, you could get an internship at somewhere really cool. Like, like say, for example, I got an internship at Lionsgate or something, right? Some really big company like that. So I would just be a guy, one guy in this massive machine. I think in a scenario like that, it would be a little bit harder to have the trajectory that I ended up having at a small company, because at a smaller company, you interact directly with the principals. They get to know you, and it's a much more personal relationship. And so it's not. I don't think it's as when it's a bigger machine. I think you might have a tougher time having any sort of upward mobility like that.
Now, so when you went in there, was that your goal to be hired, or did you maybe have another aspiration or another goal to maybe work for another company, or maybe just go off on your own?
Yeah, I had no particular aspiration. I showed up here in LA with my buddy from film school, and we got an apartment in Hollywood. And basically, for the first week we went to the beach, but then after that it was like, all right, what are we going to do? So I figured it would be worthwhile to try to learn as much as I could. And so I actually had I think I had like 2 or 3 different internships at the same time. And I just, I had no real particular goal. My end game was always to be a writer. But, when I first got to LA, I just figured as much as I can learn, it's all positive. So I just kind of showed up and, and things took the course they took.
Yeah, and that's great because because I've had friends too who moved to LA, and they said the same thing. They're like, they always felt guilty about not being outside because they're like, look, it's a beautiful day out, the beach is down the street. What the hell are we doing inside?
Yeah, for sure, man. The longer you're here too, the less you go.
until like somebody like a relative or something comes, right? And then you're like, oh,
yeah,
man.
Then you go, yeah, exactly.
So, this, and since we're talking, about this part of your career, I want to ask, because some other people who have been on, I didn't get a chance to ask them this, but what are some of the skill sets that did you think that you had at this point that really helped you stand out and really helped them, your bosses and your managers, that they saw you and they saw your skill set and they wanted to keep you. So could you know any of the skills offhand that you think that really helped you, get that promotion?
It was funny because I started as an intern, and at the end I was in charge of the interns. So I would kind of manage the interns. I would, me and other people at the company, of course, but I think primarily that was part of my job. So I would kind of see, you would give some interns, like, you give them a script, and, there were times when I was really busy and I genuinely needed to have like a really in-depth creative discussion about a script, and I didn't have time to read it. And I would give it to an intern to read, and then I'd get up, and say, hey, did you read that script? What did you think? And you really it was very noticeable. And it's actually interesting. So now a couple of years have passed since I was at that job. The guys that were my interns that I could tell had something extra, they've had continued success. Like, they've transitioned to other jobs where they've some of them have become produced filmmakers. Some of them work at other companies now, and you could tell the guys who basically had confidence and had an opinion. That's pretty much what it boils down to. If I got up and I would ask an intern, like, hey, what do you think of that script? And he was just like, yeah, it's all right. Like that's not really what you're looking for. You're looking for somebody who has confidence, has an opinion, and also is like, has a strong opinion. So if I like something and, the intern that I'm checking in with him and he didn't like it, and I say, well, I thought this worked and that worked, and he kind of backs off his opinion. I think that is also another thing that, like, your opinion is your opinion, and it's important, in my opinion, to be strong in your convictions, because once you waffle, you kind of lose credibility, so it's stuff like that, I think. And then also just the basics, right? Like, just being responsible. Like, if you're given a job to do it to the best of your ability, be on time, be pleasant to deal with. It's that type of stuff is really important too.
So would you ever sit down with a lot of these interns and go over things like, this is how you read a screenplay and these are the things to look for? Would you do stuff like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, when you would first bring them in, we'd usually try to get a coverage sample to show that they knew how to read a script, basically. And, we had our own template and stuff like that, but that, typically if somebody's coming in to be an intern in a production company, we want them to have some reading experience, because we don't want them starting from absolute scratch. I mean, then they have no real place to have a strong creative opinion. So usually we try to find somebody who had some sort of background in reading scripts, maybe they, whatever that might be, and hopefully, start from there.
So was there ever, a time when you read a screenplay and maybe you loved it and you wanted to get a feel for all these interns and maybe you gave it to them and there was a point where they said, hey boss, we really didn't like this, and then maybe you said like, hey, yeah, I loved it actually, and was there ever a time like that?
Sure, yeah. That's why, that's what you need, readers for, basically, is to kind of check you so that you can get a sense, especially if it's something a little bit out there where you're like, I think this is great, but it's pretty weird. You need, a lot of times you need that extra voice to kind of, get a sense of how it's playing. So often in situations like that, I would actually have more than one person read it. I'd have like 5 people read it. And then I'd be able to look at sort of the general response and compare and see what was consistent and stuff like that.
And that's 2 very good takeaways too. Is 1, have confidence, and 2, have an opinion. That's very important to mention, Dan, because just to everyone listening, I think that's very important too. In the general in the film industry, is that you have to have confidence, and you have to have that opinion. Which if you're as a director, you need that, or as a writer, as you need that point of view from where to tell your story.
Yeah, and that it's a funny thing because it comes back on you in so many different ways. Because if you project confidence, and it's even on the page, if you project confidence on the page and you project confidence when you then later go into a development meeting or whatever, you can kind of sway people. Like, people want to buy into that confidence. Like, somebody sitting down to read a script, if that first couple of pages is written with a really strong authorial voice, they'll kind of come with you, And if you as the writer have a really strong take on the story and feel really strongly about it and can back it up and all that stuff, people, kind of want to take that journey with you, and they want to trust your credibility as a writer. So it's so important. I think it's not to say that like, don't be inflexible. It's not about that, but you got to be confident in what you're doing, because if you're not, then there's no one else will ever be confident in you. You have to be confident in yourself, number one, and then other people can basically trust you. And, in our business, it's so tough already that if you don't project that confidence, I think it makes it way tougher.
So what are some of the things that you notice, like when we were talking about confidence on the page, what are some of the things that usually jump out at you and you can usually say like, hey, that writer, he or she believes in her own writing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a lot of different things. I think one thing for sure would be starting out with a storytelling sort of approach where you're not waiting for us. Like, the story's going, and we're either coming with you or we're not, but you're not going to hang around and hold our hand. I think that is something you'll definitely see in professional scripts, and it's a very noticeable difference from when you're reading a script maybe by a more beginning writer. You can tell the level of confidence in terms of a shorthand of communicating information, where it's asking a lot of us as the audience, like, hey, you got to keep up with me, kind of thing. And I think that when you read something like that, it actually sort of galvanizes you as the reader, because you are suddenly empowered to like figure out what's going on. And it just makes it a more dynamic experience. The worst thing you can do is have something where it's just spelling it out to you, in every way, whether that's dialogue or just the slowness of the presentation of information, or presenting old ideas as if they are new ideas, and there's the audience now is so savvy that it's really, there's a lot that can be done in shorthand. And if you're not using that shorthand, I think that's where you can kind of get into a scenario where it doesn't come across with the same level of confidence on the page.
Yeah, I agree. The audience is very savvy now. I mean, sometimes I'm watching movies and I see, cliches, and I'm always thinking to myself, I wonder if the writer, director, whoever it was, I'm always wondering, why didn't they try something else? You know what I mean? Because now, now, Dan, what I do is with movies, I'm always dissecting them in my head. Not even just, on like a piece of paper, but in my head, I'm always thinking to myself, is this a setup? Is it, what would the payoff be? I wonder what the inciting incident's going to be, and when it finally comes there, you know what I mean? I mean, do you do the same thing? Do you sit, when you watch movies now, are you just dissecting them and sort of almost trying to getting ahead of the story to see if you could, predict what the writer was thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty much ruined as an audience member at this point. I mean, I remember I used to, when I was in college, I would go with my buddy and we would sneak, we would go see one movie and then sneak around the theater, and we would do that for like 12 hours, and we would see every movie that was in the theater. And I could actually sit and watch I would watch literally anything. But now, I'm such an awful audience member. I'll find something, like you'll click something new on Netflix. 2 minutes. If there's something there that I'm watching it and I'm just like, man, I'll turn it off. Like I've become such a terrible audience member exactly because of what you're talking about. Because we're in it so much that it's like you stop consuming it kind of as like a regular consumer. You become a lot more sort of, I guess, hypercritical when you're watching stuff, because you're always thinking about the design of it and things like that.
Yeah, I know what you mean, because sometimes, I watch movies, or I even see a trailer now, and I'll say, let me guess what happens in this movie.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'll say it out in front of my friends, and they're like, how the hell would you get that from seeing this? And I'm just like, because I just, you know what I mean? You see that stuff. You see those points, you know what I mean? Like those, okay, well, this is obviously last part of the movie. I know this sounds a little bit redundant, but the first time it ever not the first time, but the most time that sticks out in my mind was when Paul Blart Mall Cop came out, and I saw the trailer, and a friend of mine went to an early screening of it, and I told him exactly what I think happens in the based on the trailer, and he goes, "Wow, you're really good at this." And now, granted, obviously, we don't go see Paul Blart Mall Cop for the writing, but that's I was just bringing that up as a point of reference.
Yeah, I mean, in general, that goes back to the authorial confidence thing, right? It's like, assume when you're starting the story, the audience is ahead of you in the same way of what you're talking about. Like, if you set it up, and they are going to be predicting a certain storyline, so you as the creator, you got to kind of know that, and you sort of knowing that, you have to give them something that's at least a little bit different, because otherwise it's going to be exactly like what you're talking about. If the audience is able to predict it like beat by beat, then you're screwed. I mean, that's really that's a really tough. It's a tough place to get away from if you're in that scenario. So you got to figure some sort of wrinkle that makes it a little bit different.
Yeah, very true. And, I actually, just as we talk about all this writing and everything else, I want to, get into your writing, so did you always, have the inclination that you wanted to be a writer-director?
Well, no, so I've directed one movie and some shorts. And then, for me, the experience of directing my movie, which is called Betrayed, pretty much told me that I would prefer to just be the writer, which, I enjoyed it, but it's just so all-consuming. So I give a lot of credit to my cousin, Oren, who directed our movie Initiation. It's really an immersive thing that you kind of you give up, you got to put a lot of yourself into it. So for me, I prefer being the writer. I mean, the experience that we had making this film is kind of like exactly what I love about being a writer, is that I was able to come in and contribute to the story, and then they went off and made the movie, and then I watched the movie. I mean, that's like, so that's when it's cool being a writer, because it's literally like you wrote something on a piece of paper, and then you get to see that it exists, and it's pretty neat.
Yeah, very true. Because I looked at your IMDb. I did see you have the short, and then you did direct Betrayed. And I wanted to just ask, what was the biggest difference that you found when you had to direct? I mean, was there any challenges that you weren't anticipating, or did you just say, you know what, I prefer to be a writer?
I mean, I think that when you're gonna direct, I mean, I love working with actors. I think working with actors is so fun, and if I ever end up directing again, it will be because of that. The part that I felt, you kind of have to be all in or not in at all for me was the visual aesthetic. I had a really great cinematographer on my film Betrayed, and he was really good about basically checking me and being like, hey, that's not gonna look good, let's do it like this. When you're primarily a writer, you don't necessarily think in that visual in the way that a director can, because you don't have the same tools. If you're someone who's constantly directing stuff and your aspiration is absolutely to direct, then you're gonna be doing the same study that you and I do for writing, right? Where we know it's so in and out, and we know all the tools and tricks and things like that. I think that and obviously you lean on your cinematographer as a director, of course, but I just felt like for me, I enjoy sort of trying to master this one facet of it, as opposed to I felt like it would be kind of a jack of all trades situation if I tried to. The directing thing, as much as I like it, I don't have the same energy with it as I do with the writing.
Yeah, when I haven't directed anything for 5 years, but I find that it's not because I don't want to. It's just because I've learned, Dan, that the writing has to be not good but great. You know what I mean? Before you're going to do any project, I've learned that it has to be. You have to, you yourself, whoever, for everyone listening to this, if you're writing something, you yourself have to get so excited about it. You're like, how the hell is this not a movie made already? You know what I mean? And you have to be so, and that's something that I've learned. So what I've been doing is I took one step forward to take two, I took one step back to take two steps forward. And basically what I mean by that is I just wanted to make sure that I got better at things. And during this whole 5-year period, I mean, I've actually produced stuff. I've actually had a graphic novel get made, stuff like that. But it's really, it all comes back to, making sure that writing is phenomenal. And, when you talk about writing, I can hear you get excited about it in your voice, and that's good, because you need that, right? So I wanted to ask, Dan, whenever you're writing, you know what I mean? Is there any things that you keep in mind to, make sure that you're always sort of going forward, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, there's a million things. I mean, that's the part that kind of it kind of sucks about the more you learn about it, right? Because I mean, when I started, it was a little bit more free, because you were just like, yeah, man, it's once you learn so much about it, then there's so many different things that you got to be thinking about. And so it actually makes, once you actually get on the page, I'm good. But the planning stage, there's a lot that you have to be thinking about. And it helps to just do it a million times. I'm very grateful for the time that I was a development executive, because I basically developed, dozens of scripts, and we made a bunch of those movies too. So I really got to see the whole process many times. And so that helps, because you sort of get almost like a muscle memory for it. But yeah, you got so much stuff you have to think about. You got, theme and character and dialogue and arc and structure and mood. And it's, there's a lot to kind of manage.
Yeah. And, one thing I've learned, and like you said, the more you learn, the more, the more you do, the more you learn, and the more you learn, you realize how complex this gets. And, I've read every screenwriting book on the market. I literally, you can't see it because it's a podcast, but I have every screenwriting book out there, and I've read it from cover to cover. I've done what everybody else does. You start with Screenplay by Sid Field, then you work up to Save the Cat, then you get Story by McKee, and then you sort of branch off from there after you read those 3 works, because, everyone sort of talks about it. But one thing I've learned over the years is that everything comes back to character. You know what I mean? Everything, when we talk about scenes, when we talk about favorite parts of a movie, when we talk about this or that, it always stems from a character.
I mean, it's very true. Yeah. I mean, I would always say when we would, when I was a development executive and we would try to put a movie together, it was in every movie that we made that actually ended up getting made, there was always a moment where we would attach somebody that was meaningful, whether that was an actor or a director or whatever. And that person, when they would come in, it wasn't like they said, you know why I'm doing this movie? Because I love the midpoint. Like, no, nobody ever said that. It was always about whatever the emotion was of it, or whatever the character thing was that we were doing. That was what they would key in on and say, man, that meant something to me, and I got something out of that. So yeah, it's all, the plot is informed by the character, and then they have to not only coexist, but actually sort of be intrinsic to each other. Like the best movies are movies where the plot has to happen because of the character. Like those two, they can't exist outside of each other.
Yeah, it's very true, and I think the mistake a lot of writers make, and I've made this mistake, more times than I can count, is developing a plot and trying to plunk characters in said plot, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think when you try to reverse that, when you try to reverse engineer or something like that, I think that's where you sort of get stuck.
Yeah.
So, when your new movie Initiation, it's being, distributed by Gravitas Ventures. Congratulations, by the way. That's freaking huge.
Yeah, no, we're very excited, and we're very proud of the film.
Yeah, I mean, that is, absolutely phenomenal. And I wanted to ask, where did your idea come from for the film? Was this an idea that came to you, or was this just something, that you have been sort of working on for years?
So this is actually something that, my cousin Oren, he had the initial idea. He had a script, and he basically, we being cousins, we both live in LA. I would always come hang with him, and he mentioned that he was working on this. And at one point, he and I talked about working on it together. And so basically, I came in and I co-wrote it. We ended up writing, revising that script and working on it together through to the end. And he directed the film and edited it and produced it. And so this was a situation where basically I came in where there was already a product that existed, and I just gave my sort of creative energy to it. And I think that we both kind of complemented each other in that process. And, that was how the process played out on this one.
So for those listening who aren't familiar with the film, could you give us a brief explanation about the film, Dan?
Yeah, so it's basically a group of strangers are kidnapped, and they're taken to this kind of mysterious house, and they basically come to realize that they've been kidnapped to take place in an initiation ritual for a cult. And to be initiated into this cult, you have to fight somebody to the death. And so these people that are complete strangers to each other, they're just random people, and they're thrown into this insane situation, and they have to try to figure out a way to survive. And that's what the movie's about.
Very cool. And it's actually cool that it's coming out right around this time, this fall, Halloween time. You know what I mean? It sounds like the movie that's right up that alleyway.
Yeah, I mean, what's been cool about it is that it toes the line between action and horror. So, we've been really happy to see that a lot of horror websites have reviewed the film and given us nice notices, because I think that it's something that's a fun movie for people that like horror movies, but it's also a fun movie for, an action fan, thriller, that type of thing.
That is very cool. And, because I mean, whenever you can see the horror sites, whenever they can get excited about something, it's always awesome, because like we were talking about with all the films, that we've seen and being able to sort of, spot the story, they've seen a ton of horror films. So, when you can get them on board of something, you know what I mean? It's like, okay, great. Now you got something, because if they like it, I mean, what's the general public going to think? You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. No. And we have shown the film to a lot of people at this point. And, enough people where it's a funny thing, your relationship with your own work, right? I mean, anytime you show something to somebody that knows you, you're kind of like, well, they might just tell me to be nice. So they thought but we've shown it to so many people. And then obviously, I think we have on IMDb, there's some reviews linked, and Bloody Disgusting gave us a nice review, and we, these are people that have no reason to tell us one way or the other, right? So when somebody that has no relationship to you tells you that they got something out of your work, then that's big, because then you figure, okay, well maybe it does work, and this is a sort of more objective proof of that.
Yeah. Exactly. And, I see that on the IMDb page, it's up on Amazon Video right now. Is there any other places that people could find the movie?
Yeah, it's all over. It's on iTunes, on Amazon, it's on PlayStation, it's on a lot of cable on-demand providers. I was home in Baltimore, and I saw it on my parents' cable at their house. It's on Vudu. It's on the majority of video on demand providers.
And I will link to that, everyone, in the show notes. I will make sure to link to all those places that you can check out The Initiation. I wanted to ask, also about The Initiation. Dan, what's one thing you want people to take away from the film? I mean, did you want to have people leave going, damn, that was intense, or was there any other sort of theme that you wanted people to walk away from? Walk away with the movie from?
A friend of mine just watched it, and that was pretty much what he emailed me. He said, "Damn, that was intense." What was cool about it for me was that I think we succeeded at something that I'm always trying to do, which is take what's a genre movie and basically invest it with a real meaning that it's not just kind of an empty genre exercise. That it's actually has a message, has a point to it that is emotional. That is, this movie is basically about the idea that no matter what situation you're kind of put into, if you have this sort of inner strength to defeat it, then there's nothing anyone can do to you. And, we sort of explore that in a lot of different ways in the film, but it was something that, meant something to me. And I think that it gives the film a weight that, if we sort of just relied on all the genre stuff, it wouldn't have that same weight to it. So that was the thing to me that I was most satisfied with.
Just as a side note, a screenwriting professor once told me a great piece of screenwriting advice, and that was when you're sitting down to brainstorm a concept or whatever for your movie, he said, this is a question you ask yourself: what do you want audiences to leave? What do you want audiences, when they leave, to take away from this movie? Do you want them to say, "Oh my God, that was hilarious"? And he said that helps guide you throughout the process when you're making the movie.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you gotta do it for a reason. I mean, there's too much stuff out there. It takes too long. It's too much of a pain in the ass. If you're not doing it out of some strong impulse and it doesn't necessarily always have to be heavy. We're like right now, my cousin and I are talking about doing another film together, and we're talking about doing one that's a little bit more sort of light, at least in the tone. That can be fine too, but it's just whatever that impulse is that you have that makes it interesting and exciting for you, you got to really feel strongly about that and kind of, and key on that throughout the whole thing, because that's what you want the person who watches it to have, that same feeling.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And, I think, when we can finally convey that, you know what I mean? Like, I think, like, for instance, Quentin Tarantino, whenever he writes, I'm thinking that's the same thing that people pull away from, is the same mood he's in, you know what I mean? Particularly like Hateful Eight. I have a, that's sort of like it was the same, but it was different for him. And I sort of think that, you could sort of pull away what he puts into the script, if you know what I mean. And I wanted to ask, Dan, as we know, we were talking about your future projects. I wanted just to ask, what does a typical writing day for you look like?
Man, it's just if I can just get some time. That's really time is the most important thing. I mean, I'm not. For me, it's not like I'll write anywhere. I'll write at any time. I don't need to consult the muse or anything. Like, I can just sit down and bang some stuff out. But I think that I have a tough time. I'm sort of an impatient person, which I think is probably a pretty important part of any success that I have had or will have, is that I'm not patient to just let things come as they may. Like I want to get stuff done and kind of that's always my ethos. So when the planning part of it, that's the part that takes forever. Like I'll do research, on initiation. I did research into military stuff. On other projects I've written, I'll read like 3 books about it. But once it's time to write and I actually have figured out the story, I have such a burning desire to just get it out of me and get it onto the page. It's almost to the point where like I feel like I'm going to lose it if I don't. That it comes very fast, and I almost will consciously try to set aside, just a couple of days or whatever where I know it's going to just be kind of flowing out of me, and just be able to kind of bang pages out because, it's just a difference in process, right? For me, the real cracking of the story comes in the planning. The actual writing is just putting the planning on a piece of paper. So the writing itself is the fun part. The hard part is coming up with the actual story.
Yes, I could not agree more. That's something that I found too, is that, because once I have an outline or a treatment or anything, you know what I mean? Like even if it's a piece of paper with some ideas, scribbled down on it that looks like the journal from Seven, just something I know where I'm going, you know what I mean? And, the biggest part though is always, where the plot is going, but then I've realized it always comes back to where the characters start. You know what I mean? So when the script starts is where the movie starts. So then where do we find our characters when the script starts? You know what I mean? Do they have something? Do they not have something? What's their desire?
Right.
What's their intention? What's their obstacle?
Yeah, for sure.
So, Dan, I mean, like on average, how often? I mean, like how many hours a day do you write? I mean, is it like sometimes like 30 minutes, and then sometimes maybe it's like 2 hours?
I think that on a day when I actually can really, when I have nothing going and I can really just sit and focus on writing, I think after like 3 or 4 hours, you got to stop. And I've done it. I've had times where I'll sit and I'll write for like, I'll write the whole day. But I think, as a general rule, unless it's something where I've gone insane and I have to, I think that 3 or 4 hours of focused writing, after that it starts to become diminishing returns. Just your brain it takes a certain sort of brain muscle, I think, to come up with this stuff. And after a while you start, like, you don't have that same, because, it's sort of what we were talking about before, like, each scene that you write, you really got to sit and think about it and think about like, okay, here's the regular version of this scene. Why is this scene going to be somewhat cooler than the regular version? Like, how can I make it different? How can I make it different, not just in what happens, but in how the characters interact with each other? What's the visual thing that I'm doing in this scene? What's the reversal in this scene? So there's so much like mental effort that goes into it that I think after 3 or 4 hours, I got to stop. So for me, a good 3 or 4 hours of writing and then maybe some research, in the afternoon, or a lot of prep for the next day, like, okay, tomorrow I know I got to write these scenes. Here's kind of what I'm thinking, and at least have a little bit of a roadmap of the actual precise execution. And then you can kind of flow into the next day.
Yeah, that's kind of like what I think Stephen King maybe said that. He said basically he ends on a high note. That way, the next day he comes in, he knows exactly where he's going to go, and he keeps that flow going on every day. Yeah,
I tend to do that as well.
Oh, great minds think alike. And that's great advice, by the way. So, Dan, in closing, is there maybe anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to, or any sort of parting thoughts you want to add to this conversation?
No, I think the thing that's cool to me about this project specifically, and I think is relevant to what we're talking about, and probably to a lot of people listening to your podcast, is, this is something that any of us could do. You could have made this movie. Anybody listening to this could have made this movie. It's a movie that we made for a low budget, but one of the reasons that it's been so cool getting some nice reviews from some horror sites is that they basically said, yeah, it's a low budget movie, but the sort of ingenuity and the effort that went into it, and that made it doesn't feel low budget. It's the point being that there's nothing stopping any of us from just going and making a movie, and not just a movie that we sort of is a navel gazing for our own edification. but a movie that anybody can sit down and watch and enjoy as a real movie, you know, even if you have to do it for a low budget. You know, and I think that this is sort of, to me, a good case study of that we actually went, made this movie, got it distributed by a very legitimate distributor. It's out everywhere, you know, and, you know, we've gotten a lot of nice responses to the movie, so we do think that the movie works, and, you know, we just look forward to hopefully having people discover it, you know, and then maybe we can go make another one.
You know, and that's phenomenal. And honestly, Dan, I'm going to make sure to check out the initiation. I will link to that in the show notes. Dan, where can we find you out online?
I mean, you know, just stuff with the movie. I'm like the worst person ever for all this. I don't have a Twitter or anything. I'm not a social media dude, but the initiation movie, we have a website, we have a Facebook page, and obviously it's on iTunes, it's on Amazon, it's on all these other platforms.
Awesome. And again, I'll link to that in the show notes. Everyone, you know, it's DaveBullis.com. Twitter, it's @Dave_Bullis. Dan, I want to say thank you very much for coming on.
My pleasure. A good conversation.
Oh, my pleasure, sir. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Find Dave at DaveBullis.com. Please make sure to subscribe and share the podcast.